is so significant about the Magnitsky case and your involvement for the audience in Ukraine, which probably hadn't been followed, just known about the Magnitsky Act and some of the results?
Well, the Magnitsky case there's nothing unusual about the Magnitsky case. Sergei Magnitsky suffered the same fate as thousands and thousands of other people have suffered, which is the fate of a corrupt regime, the Putin regime, basically going after somebody who wanted a better country for his people. Sergei Magnitsky uncovered a massive government corruption scheme and thought that Putin and his colleagues would care about it. And so he exposed it, and instead of caring about the corruption, Putin cared about the people who were benefiting from the corruption. And they arrested Sergei, they put him in jail, they tortured him viciously for 358 days, and they killed him 6 years ago today. And the reason why this is so significant is it's not different than other cases. What's so significant about it is that the details of this case are completely known. There is no plausible deniability. There's no little green men. There's no ability for Putin and his people to say that they didn't know about this. Everything is documented. Everything about his torture is documented, and everything about the financial crime that he discovered is documented. And the reason why Putin hates this case so much is it proves that Putin is not a nationalist. He's not fighting for the national interest of Russia. He's fighting for the ill-gotten gains, the money stolen by his corrupt official. And he's fighting against patriots, people like Sergei Magnitsky. And this case is an emblematic case because of that, and has become a world-famous case because of that, because anybody who looks at it, it's so obvious that Putin is an evil man doing bad against his country.
And what we are interested in now, we do have a number of Ukrainian prisoners in Russia, and there are a lot of different things of the an attempts to create a Savchenko list, Sentsov list, anything. But what we understand, what people should know also about the Magnitsky Act, and what it had changed in the international system of the keeping people responsible for the corruption and human rights.
Well, basically, after Sergei Magnitsky was murdered, I was absolutely desperate to get some kind of justice for him. He was my lawyer. Had he not been my lawyer, he would still be alive today. And so I took a great personal responsibility to get justice. And when I went out to the world to see what kind of justice one could get, I discovered that there were no concepts of justice. That if something like this happens in Russia, there's nothing you could do. And I was so heartbroken by this and frustrated by this idea that you couldn't do anything, that I said, if no concepts of justice exist, we need to invent a new concept of justice. And I looked around at the way that the Russians behave, and they do this terrible stuff inside their own country, and then they go on vacation to Saint-Tropez, and they go to New York City shopping, and they send their kids to boarding school in Britain. And I realized that there's a huge opportunity, leverage, to basically stop these people from doing bad stuff by punishing them in the West, by taking away their visas and freezing their assets. And this was the genesis for what's become known as the Magnitsky Act in America, where the American Congress, after hearing the story of Sergei Magnitsky, passed a law which said that the people who killed Sergei, but also the people who do other terrible things, like the people who kidnapped Savchenko, those people shouldn't be allowed to travel to America, and those people should have their assets frozen. And so this is now a real law which can be implemented by the U.S. government against Russian officials who do this stuff. And so my hope is that this becomes a widespread process. So far, there are only 34 people's names on this list. 28 of them were involved in Magnitsky, 6 of them were involved in other cases. My hope is that given the thousands of human rights violators there are in Russia, that there will be thousands of people on this list.
But can you explain how it really works? Because some people are confused. It's all about, case of Magnitsky or case of, maybe it could be connected just to Russia. So what should be done in order that people are in this list, and what the evidence should be?
Well, that's a very good question. So basically, the Magnitsky law says that people who commit gross human rights abuses in Russia can be added to this list. And when I say in Russia, I should say Russian officials who commit gross human rights abuses. So if they go into Ukraine and kidnap somebody and bring them back to Russia and effectively hold them hostage, that's a gross human rights abuse. So what does one do to put somebody on the Magnitsky list? Well, the State Department says there needs to be evidence, credible evidence, of their involvement in a gross human rights abuse. So you can't just show up in Washington and denounce somebody and hope that the U.S. government is going to add them to the Magnitsky list. They won't do that. It has to be based on facts and evidence. And so what we encourage activists to do, and we've been talking to all of the victims of big crimes in Russia, is we urge them to put together documentary evidence, what they have, what they can prove to show that somebody has committed a human rights abuse. So that may not be, Putin is not going to be put on this list because he wasn't the one who signed the detention order. But a judge who signed a detention order knowing that that person didn't commit a crime could very well be put on the list.
So would you say that, for instance, just to imagine that in case of Sentsov and Kolichenko, these are two Ukrainians who had been kidnapped, and Gennady and Astafyev as well. There are three Ukrainians who are now convinced and sentenced for 20 years and less, that in their case, they've been kidnapped from the Ukrainian territory, currently are in Russia. So it's about the officials who were persecuting them, and these are the people who could be targeted or potentially get into this list.
Right. Well, they can be officials or they can be private citizens. Anybody who is involved in a human rights abuse. And what's a human rights abuse? I would think that hostage taking is a human rights abuse, torture is a human rights abuse, false imprisonment is a human rights abuse. All of these things, if one can prove that somebody was involved. So it's very easy in the Russian system because everything is so well documented. It's like nobody has any shame about their involvement in these things, and so you can figure out exactly who is involved in the Sentsov case. It's clear. There's no ambiguity about it, and my hope is that the people, the lawyers working for him, will be able to assemble that evidence and present it to the U.S. government, who, by the way, is very sympathetic to these cases. That the U.S. government would probably be happy with proper evidence to add people to these lists.
And were the Ukrainian activists and politicians and maybe state officials approaching you to really get a bit of the understanding and maybe some kind of help, assistance in order how to work with that?
Not so much Ukrainian state officials, but the lawyers who represent these persecuted victims have approached us on a number of cases, and we are happy to provide lots of help to them in structuring their presentations and explaining to them from what we know is required by the U.S. government to get people added to these lists.
And what is interesting also, we always used to we usually separate human rights abuse and corruption. And that's why it's sometimes very hard to prove what is corruption, what is human rights abuse, and how it goes with the Magnitsky Act.
Well, corruption doesn't fall specifically within the Magnitsky Act for the broad number of cases. And so it all comes down to human rights abuses. In the Magnitsky case specifically, it also includes the corruption that he uncovered, but it doesn't include... so, for example, in Sentsov, what would be relevant to the U.S. government is how he was tortured, how he was falsely imprisoned, and who was involved in those things.
Magnitsky Act is the decision done by the U.S. government, and there was a couple of years of lobbying and a lot of activities in order this law is passed. How it's going on with Europe, with Britain, and why are these governments, you would say, reluctant to really do that, and what are you doing regarding that?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the next likely candidate for a realistic probability of a Magnitsky Act is Canada. Canada has a new government who's pledged to impose the Magnitsky Act. It's a domestic political issue in Canada. There's a large population of Ukrainian and other East European immigrants. And so I think Canada will be the next place to go. Here in the UK, we have a real problem, which is that there's a huge amount of Russian money sloshing around, and there's a lot of people benefiting from that in the establishment of Britain. And so even though there's many people in this country that are shocked and outraged by the Magnitsky case, there's also people being paid by the Putin regime to try to keep the system here in place. And so we're fighting against that. Ironically, Putin is probably my best lobbyist for getting a Magnitsky Act passed in the UK, because the more horrific things he does in Ukraine, the more he bombs the not ISIS but Syrian opposition, the more refugees he creates in Europe, the more it becomes impossible for even his friends and apologists to support him.
But regarding the business, you're coming from the private sector. You are the ones who were doing business in Russia for a while, and especially you probably know very well the foreign investors and all this, all the circle of the people who coming to work with Russia, who want to work with the Russian money, which are there. So currently, how are you talking to these people? I mean, you from a different sphere. It's very different when the human rights activist or somebody, from approach them. But we hear a lot of people who want to have a business as usual and lift the sanctions against Russia, especially in the business circle. How is discussion going on? Can you influence on something? And what the feedback you're getting from also the British business, from the European business?
Well, business has always been against everything I've been doing ever since I started my campaign. Business has been the worst sort of opposition group to getting human rights laws passed. And so there's really nothing one can do with them. However, it's interesting because most people want to get out of Russia now. Nobody's trying to get into Russia. It's a crazy place. And the worst, they create a terrible investment climate for Russia by stealing everything. So if you have a good business, let's say you have a apartment building or a warehouse or a factory, there's almost a 100% certainty that somebody from the FSB is going to come to you and try to take it away from you. And so it's not as if there's any kind of good business to be done there. There's only bad business to be done there. And so the people who are fighting against human rights legislation are the people who are stuck there, who are just desperately holding on to their assets and hoping that they don't get taken away. But these are not, as time goes on, there are less and less people like this who are there to oppose me.
But do you feel any threat and any danger because of the strong also Russian presence here in London? We heard a lot from different Russian, the Russians who had moved to London, feeling that they could be, their phones could be hacked. They are sometimes probably under the still control of the Russian security service.
Yeah. So we had a terrifying experience 3 years ago where a man named Alexander Perepelichny, who came to us with information about the Magnitsky case, financial information about the Magnitsky case, which allowed us to share that information with the Swiss government, who froze $20 million in Switzerland. And Alexander Perepelichny suddenly died in London outside his home at the age of 44 with no history of previous health problems. And it's my contention that he was murdered and murdered by the Russian secret police, the FSB, for exposing their crimes. And so, yes, this is a dangerous place to be. Every place is a dangerous place to be. When you go across Vladimir Putin, there are no rules anymore. The rules are he'll do whatever he can get away with.
How you and your colleagues, your group have managed to track the money, because to track the money which had been stolen and which were the evidence that these were the people connected to the Magnitsky death?
Well, we had a few lucky breaks. One of them was a very unlucky break, which was this man Perepelichny, who came to us with this information, who subsequently died. We also had a group called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which is an NGO that focuses on corruption, who were able to get a bunch more documents showing transfers through Moldova. And then we've been working hand in hand with 14 different law enforcement agencies around the world, and putting together all this information that we have from the whistleblowers, from law enforcement agencies, and from public records. We've been able to trace about 200 million of the $230 million that was stolen in the Magnitsky crime. And every time we trace it, we then can make another criminal complaint to another country. And slowly and surely, the noose is tightening. And there's now $50 million of ill-gotten gains that have been frozen by different countries' law enforcement agencies against the Magnitsky perpetrators.
What would be probably your advice in this regard about tracking the Ukrainian dirty money?
Well, I don't think money is all that hard to track, particularly if a government wants to track it, because they have all sorts of tools that are not available to private citizens in terms of treaties with other countries that are obliged to help. The problem, as I understand it, in Ukraine is not everybody is trying to do the right thing. There is still, Ukraine is a very deeply corrupt country even after the change of Yanukovych, and there's lots of people who don't necessarily want to get to the bottom of these crimes because there's so many people who are still around who benefited from them.
So there are those who are saying it's just difficult. What would be your answer on that? What actually is needed in order to track the dirty money? Well,
you need people with expertise in doing this, and you need people with a motivation to actually do it properly, and you need and it's very difficult when you have state employees who are either corrupt or lazy doing these types of things, and probably the Ukrainian government needs to bring in some outside specialists who are not corruptible, who are also good at this type of stuff.
But who are these specialists? Because, we do have some kind of anti-corruption activists, but it sometimes requires probably a different kind of expertise and
I would say that there are international specialists that do this, and they should report directly to the president without any committees beforehand who go after these people. Otherwise, you end up with people who are benefiting from it, who are either putting moral pressure or maybe even worse on the people who are actually trying to find the money. There's a whole sort of industry of people who track down stolen money, dirty money, etc. Normally they do it for the private sector. So if some company has been defrauded, they can go and hire one of these specialists. And I don't have their names off the tip of my tongue, but there are many people in this industry. But the moment that you have state employees who aren't any good at it or potentially corrupt, then the whole system, no one has any confidence in the system and it doesn't work. And so I think that there's an overhaul that needs to be done to go after the dirty money that Yanukovych and his colleagues stole.
So, meaning that it's kind of not that difficult if you really want.
It is not that difficult if you really want it, and we're here to prove it. I mean, I'm not a government, but with a small team of people over 5 years, we've been able to trace the $230 million that led to the murder of Sergei Magnitsky to 14 different countries, and I did so without any of the powers of a sovereign state. And with the powers of a sovereign state, one could do it a lot faster and a lot better.
How to keep the international community focused and interested? Because we think that when there is a new cycle, and sometimes these issues like Sentsov, Korchenko, Magnitsky, they are not anymore popular. It wasn't really easy also with the Magnitsky Act. There were also different
wheel gets the grease. It requires the people who care about these cases continue to find opportunities to talk about them, to expose more information about them, to show the injustice in different ways, so that people don't forget. It's the world has a lot of things to think about, and it requires the people who care to keep on fighting for attention.
But there is the question in Ukraine as well. Okay, you have these guys in the list, being the Russian officials. They can't travel to Saint-Tropez, to Biarritz or elsewhere. So what? Is it really something big for them?
Well, let me tell you what is really big for them is that everybody knows that the Putin regime will not last forever. It might last 20 years, it might last 2 months. And everyone knows that when it ends, the bad guys, the ones who committed all these crimes in the Putin regime, they would like to think, or they have historically thought, that they could leave Russia and then settle quietly in England or America or France or Vienna, and that it would all be fine. Now all of a sudden, if someone's name is put on a list of human rights violators, nobody will take them. They will not be able to get asylum anywhere. And so let's say the Russian government falls and there's a new government that's hostile to the criminals of the Putin regime. And so they're out looking for those guys. And England's not going to take them, and America's not going to take them, and France is not going to take them. Where do they go? And that's the scariest thing for anybody who's in one of these dictatorships is, where are you going to go?
As somebody who knew and probably knows Russian business elite, what do you know about the current situation, about who is really owning and running Russia? We hear a lot of information, not just about people like Abramovich and the others, but the kids, the children of the high-level officials, heads of FSB and the other organization who are running the banks, who are running the companies, like becoming a new aristocracy, like the kids of the heads of the regime. So what would you know about the way how the Russian economy currently is run?
Well, the Russian economy is very concentrated, and mostly in state enterprises at this point. The people who run Russia is Putin and the FSB people who are around him. And what Putin does is he creates, in order to stay in power, he creates huge rewards for loyalty, and huge punishments, like fatal punishments for disloyalty. And so in order to keep his people around him on side, you get rich if you do what he says, and you die if you in any way question what he says. And so in order to create these rewards, that's where all this money is coming from for the members of the FSB and their children and their wives. There's the daughter of the defense minister of Russia has this multi-million-dollar house, the Buddhist house outside of Moscow, worth $20 million. I mean, there's crazy stuff like that. At the end of the day, it's all of Russia, all the resources of Russia are in the hands of 10,000 people.
You said Putin is vulnerable. So what is his vulnerability?
Well, at the end of the day, it's impossible to run a regime where 140 million people are living a bad life and 10,000 people are living a good life. It's just not a sustainable situation. And so what Putin has tried to do is to try to create some type of huge diversion. And Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, is not because Putin cares about recreating the Soviet Union. All Putin wanted to do was be at war with somebody, to create a war with somebody. The Ukrainian people have suffered from his own diversion tactics in order so that his people don't turn against him. At some point, all these diversion tactics won't work anymore. And at that point, there'll be some unpredictable event. Like, who would have thought that signing an association agreement with Europe would lead to the revolution in Ukraine? I mean, the association agreement is a nonsense. There's nothing to it. It's like but because that was the one thing that just, set everybody on fire. Who knows what that event will be in Russia?
You said that the Russian opposition should better leave Russia to be in a safe place and influence the Russian population with the information. But what do you mean by that? The people are in their, islands of information. They are kind of in isolation. It's not like we don't have information about what's really happening in Russia. It's just about the political, the people who really want to listen to what they want to listen. So what is the way? Is it creating the Russian-speaking television? How to inform the people who really do not want to hear?
Well, the answer is that I don't think we have much of an opportunity. I think that as time goes on, first of all, what they've done right now is they've taken all the main levers of communication, the state television, radio, even newspapers now, are pretty much all of them are either censored or self-censored, and so nobody is telling the truth inside of Russia. As time goes on, the tolerance for any type of alternative information is going to become lower and lower, and they're going to use every tool they have to squash out any alternative information in Russia. You're not going to have, like you had in the Soviet times, Radio Free Europe being broadcast in by shortwave radio. They're going to ban all information. I mean, my prediction is that Putin has effectively no choice but to go the North Korean model of just completely closing up the country, because he can't sustain himself with any type of liberalism or any type of alternative information. And in that kind of situation, you can't be an opposition activist in North Korea, and you're not going to be able to be an opposition activist in Russia. The only thing you can do is to try to influence things from the outside.
You were criticized for your position on arrest of Khodorkovsky in 2003. Many times it's a known fact that at that time you were rather supportive for the Russian administration, for Vladimir Putin. After Mikhail Khodorkovsky is free, what are your relations with him? Do you meet with him?
Yeah, I had lunch with him last week, actually. He's coming to our event tonight. We had business disputes in the late 1990s, but I think that our fights over money were insignificant compared to our common interest in making sure that this evil dictator, Vladimir Putin, doesn't ruin Russia forever.
Just something more, let's say, on a personal level. What I'm curious, with you and Mikhail Khodorkovsky as well, where is this moment when you really, do you really need to change fully your, intention, your view on the, let's say, politics, coming from somebody who think you can work within Russia as a businessman to gain more money, to a campaigner, human rights activist, more or less, as also from Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is a close ally of the government and later is a political prisoner. Do you really need to wait to this moment when somebody dies or imprisoned in order to, change this? Because there are still a lot of people in power who still think it's not about them.
Yeah, well, in my case, we were fighting against corruption long before we were fighting against the Putin regime. But, the problem is it's one of these things where everybody lives in their own world. So if you're a businessman, you think, I'm just doing business, this has nothing to do with me, Sergei Magnitsky has nothing to do with me, etc. What I discovered is that everything has to do with everything, and you can't really live in a country where the regime is arresting political opposition candidates or killing political opposition candidates, because that means that there's no self-correcting mechanisms when things go wrong. There's no way in America, if somebody makes a mistake, the president or a congressman, they'll lose their job because the people will kick them out. Everybody is accountable to the people. In Russia, they've created a situation where the leaders are accountable to nobody, and as a result, they can make huge mistakes and abuse their power, and there's no consequence. And so, therefore, there's no way to move forward as a business person or any other type of person in that country.
As a business person who used to work in Russia, what do you think so far were the mistakes you have done? I'm not speaking about the death of Sergei Magnitsky. We understand that we can't take the responsibility for that, but really for things you were doing as a businessman at that time.
Well, the main mistake I made was thinking that Vladimir Putin was acting in the national interest and supporting him publicly for the first 3 years of his presidency. That was a huge mistake. I gave him legitimacy when he didn't deserve any.
Do you have any evidence or information that people who, while tracking the money regarding the Magnitsky case, that has something to do with Ukraine, with the Ukrainian officials or people there?
We found that in the money laundering that took place of the Magnitsky crime, from the Magnitsky crime, it went through several Latvian companies, which were also used, or the directors of those companies were also used to launder money from the Yanukovych regime. And so everybody was using the same money laundering system, the same pipes, if you will, for money laundering. And so once you start uncovering this stuff, everything connects to everything. The criminals that were involved in these types of things did them for everybody, did the money laundering for everybody. And once you start delving into it, huge amounts of money get exposed.
So you mentioned the Latvian banks, but there were any Ukrainian officials or at least people connected to the Ukrainian government, previous or I don't know any?
Well, I'm sure there were. We haven't found them yet, but we found very specific people involved in Latvia that were connected to both crimes.